Good evening. I'm Pat Mannon. We're glad to have you tonight. Join us in this study. And we're coming to you live from Northwest Arkansas. Thank you for being a part of this. I'm joined tonight by Ben Soto and by Brother Mark Bradbury, and we're glad to have them with us and assisting in the production of this tonight. We hope you'll enjoy the study. We've been studying Paul's life now for many, many weeks and months. In fact, this is around the 30th to the 31st lesson in this series. And tonight I'm hoping that we get finished. I hope we can. And then we'll begin a study of some other topic, which we'll select here very soon. And when we know that, we'll certainly announce it. But thanks again for being with us. And let me remind you of last week where we left off in our study. We studied, of course, the second and third missionary journeys of Paul. We're doing a summary now of all the many studies that we've had together and summarizing Paul's entire life from his youth all the way to the time of his death. And so I'm hoping that this will tie everything together that we've talked about and give you a chance to go back through it again and to have it lodge better in your memory. Of course, these videos remain up on the web, and they're always there for you to view and to refresh yourselves on any particular part of Paul's life, or all of it, for that fact, if you want to examine it. So tonight we'll take up as Paul concludes the third missionary journey. Remember, he has stopped at Jerusalem. Now, likely he would go down to Antioch again, which is always the starting place, but he gets arrested here in Jerusalem, and the year here now that we're dealing with is about 58 AD. I'll show you a little bit later how we know the accuracy of that date, because we actually do, and it's very accurate. So around 58 AD, Paul has reached Jerusalem now, and remember, he's taken up a collection for the poor saints there in Jerusalem. He'd promised Peter and James and John that he would do that. And he was always willing to do that. He longed to do that, in fact. Gentile churches like up in Galatia and in Macedonia, the congregations there at Philippi and Thessalonica, Berea, and then the churches down in Achaia, which were Corinth, and they're in Greece, of course, any others, and the church maybe in Caesarea. All of these had generously donated for the poor saints at Jerusalem, and Paul was carrying this back to Jerusalem with him. And he, remember, wanted to get there by the Feast of Pentecost because Jews would be there from around the world, and especially from that area where he was taking the funds. He would be able to distribute that much more easily, having contact with all those brethren while he's there. So he delivers that money, and it's well received. He'd been concerned about that. And then he meets with James, and James is concerned about Paul's reputation regarding the law, because some of the Jewish Christians there don't believe that Paul is very stringent in his feelings about the law, and so they want to see him prove himself a little bit better. So James tells him, we've got 4 men here that have a vow, and in order to prove yourself to the brethren here that you yourself keep the law, buy the sacrifices, be it charges for these sacrifices, pay for them as they offer them in connection with the vow that they've fulfilled, and show thereby that you do support a lot of what we all believe regarding the law. Paul agreed to that because his knowledge of the law at this point, that didn't violate his conscience. I'm sure later on Paul would have probably never done this. But remember, all of the New Testament revelation came gradually, not all at once. And so Paul had received some instruction on this, but not all that he would be given, as evidenced by the epistles that he later wrote when he was at Rome. But now then, he is in the temple, he is purified, and he's there for the purpose that James and the others have requested. But there are Jews there from Asia, and they've seen him in the city of Jerusalem there with a man named Trophimus, who was an Ephesian man, and they knew that Trophimus was a Gentile, and so they just start the rumor that Paul has brought a a Gentile into the temple area where Gentiles were not permitted to be, and that he's thereby polluted the temple, brought great reproach on that place. So they stir up a mob with no evidence whatsoever, no eyewitnesses that Paul is in that facility with a Gentile whatsoever. Yet they stir up a mob there, and the mob doesn't know what's going on, as mobs usually don't. And of course, they are incited there around the temple area. They get Paul, and they're beating him. Now, it so happens that the Romans have built a tower of Antonio, is near the wall there, and it looks down on the temple area so that the Romans, who have a garrison of soldiers there, can actually spy down on the Jews and their activities. And they see the tumult there going on in the temple area. They see the mob beating this man. And the chief captain, whose name is Lysias, sends his soldiers down to snatch Paul out of the hands of the Jews, because they're going to kill him if this continues. And he delivers Paul then and takes possession of him and really saves Paul's life. As they're going up the stairway that led from the temple up into the tower, Paul asked Lysias, this chief captain, if he can address the crowd. Can I speak, in other words, to these Jews? He asked them. Now Lysias is glad to grant that, because he doesn't know what's going on, and perhaps Paul will answer regarding any charges against him, and he'll get to the bottom of all this. But instead of Paul defending himself and answering regarding charges that might be against him, he offers no self-defense. He tries to convert the Jews. And so we study then in Acts 22 this speech from the stairway, and it's the story of Paul's conversion told in his own words. He tells how he saw the Lord, how he went into the city of Damascus there as the Lord commanded him to, and a disciple named Ananias came and recovered his sight for him and told him to arise and be baptized, which he did immediately. And then he tells that the Lord had told him there as he was preaching in those synagogues to get out of the city, to leave, and of course that he was going to send him far away to the Gentiles. And of course, he was in a Gentile city there at Damascus, but nonetheless, when they heard the word Gentiles, when he told the Jews that he was being sent to Gentiles, they began to cry out for his death. And thankfully, Lysias still had him there on the stairway, and the soldiers actually had to lift Paul up and carry him up the stairway to keep the Jews from doing violence to him. They were going to rip him apart. Lysias next commanded his soldiers there to scourge Paul, to beat him, to find out what all was going on, to get a confession out of him, in other words. And as they were preparing to, preparing to scourge Paul, Paul exercised his Roman citizenship. He was a natural-born Roman citizen. And so he told his fellows that were going to beat him about his citizenship, and they sent word quickly to Lysias, who asked him if he were a citizen, and he told him yes. And so that changes everything, because a Roman citizen had rights that other people didn't have in the ancient world. They had the right, of course, to a hearing, to a trial, for their accusers to be brought before their face and bring the charges, and of course, Paul had that right as a citizen. They had bound him, which was illegal. You could not bind a Roman like this, not without the charges being brought. And Lysias was afraid they were in real trouble with Rome over this matter. So he was scared to death. So they gave Paul some liberty. They kept him there, but not knowing his situation, they did grant him the privilege of being visited by people who knew him. Now the next day, Lysias is trying to find out what's going on. So he arranged a meeting between the Jewish Sanhedrin Council and Paul, and the next day he took Paul down to the council. As Paul began to explain his situation, he saw very quickly these Jews weren't interested. They were not interested in justice. They weren't interested in truth. And so since Paul saw that nothing he could say was going to change their minds, he decided to divide the council. He knew that council quite well from his past. He knew some of them were Pharisees and they believed in the resurrection and spirits and angels, and he knew that the Sadducees didn't. And so he talked about how he believed in the hope of the resurrection and divided that council, and this got the Pharisees defending him, but the Sadducees clamoring for his destruction. And so it divided the council and just created an uproar. It was so bad that Lysias was afraid that Paul would be hurt in all of that scuffle, and so he delivered Paul again from that meeting. And he had tried the remedy there of scourging, and that didn't work when Paul asserted his citizenship. So Paul happened to have a nephew about that time that visited him, and he had a very good reason for coming to see Paul. He had overheard a conspiracy. 40 men had conspired that they would not eat or drink until Paul was killed. And they were very serious about that, and Paul had his nephew taken to Lysias, this chief captain. The nephew explained what he had overheard, and Lysias told him to keep it secret. Then he had the problem then of what to do with Paul, because his life is now in danger. 40 men are going to kill him. He decided that I will send him down to Felix, the governor, who was at Caesarea, and I will do it overnight before the Jews can come to me requesting that he be brought down again. You see, the Jews' plot was they were going to have Paul brought down one more time, except this time they would kill him on the way down. He would not be going back. And so Paul knew this. The nephew had told him that, and of course, getting word to Lysias, he delivered him from that, and the plan was to take him by night to Caesarea, which they did. The problem is that Felix, being governor there, Lysias don't know what to tell him. There are no charges brought against Paul. What's he going to say is the reason that he's sending him down there? So he does the best he can. He writes him a letter to Felix, explaining the situation as best he can determine it right then. And then Paul is brought down to Caesarea, there on the seacoast of the Mediterranean, and he's delivered over to Felix, and that letter is given to Felix that Lysias had written, kind of explaining why everyone's there. The soldiers that brought him down returned, and now Felix, the governor, has Paul there in Caesarea. Friends, he will stay there now, remember, 2 years, from 58 to 60. I'll tell you why 60 in just a moment. So he dies around 68, but he's in Caesarea in prison for 2 years under Felix. Now, they confine him there in that facility in Caesarea in Herod's judgment hall, and he's kept there for that 2-year period. The Jews, of course, in the meantime have come and they've talked to Lysias, and he's told them about the situation and how Paul is now down in Caesarea. And so they're permitted to go down and bring accusations. 5 days later actually, they showed up. The high priest, a man named Ananias, he came with the elders and with a certain orator named Tertullus. Tertullus is, you might call him, a slick attorney. He's very silver-tongued. He's a very great speaker. And so they bring the best public speaker they can get to bring these charges against Paul there in front of Felix, hoping to persuade him. Tertullus began his speech there the next day and began to make the accusations against Paul. He had no evidence, of course. But he charged Paul with 3 main things. Number 1, he said that he was a mover of sedition among the Jews. That is, he was starting an uprising, a real sedition. Secondly, he was a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. So they saw Christianity as just a Jewish sect. And since Jesus was from Nazareth, they called it the sect of the Nazarenes. And then he said Paul had profaned the temple, brought reproach on it and polluted it by bringing Gentiles in, of course, was the real charge. And then Tertullus criticized Lysias for interfering when the Jews would have taken care of Paul. And of course, what they would have done is killed him if Lysias hadn't stepped in. But anyway, he accused him of taking Paul out of the hands of the Jews when they would have done justice. And he told Felix that Lysias would confirm every one of these charges. Now, that was a lie, of course, but that's what he told Felix. And now Paul was given an opportunity to make a reply there in Acts chapter 24. You'll read the account of this. He makes reply to these charges. The first charge was that he was a mover of sedition among the Jews. And Paul told him, look, I've only been in this area for 12 days. It's only been 12 days since I came to Jerusalem. 6 of them, the last 6, I've spent here in Caesarea. So that only leaves 6 days for me to start an insurrection. That's hardly enough time for someone that's going to bring sedition and cause a problem there among the Jews. So these charges he's showing them are just false. There's not enough time for this. I've only had 6 actual days. Secondly, on the second charge, he admits that what they call heresy was the way he worshiped, and that he worshiped the God of his fathers just like the Jews did, that he believed the law and the prophets just like they did, and that he had the same hope of the resurrection of the dead which most Jews entertained. And so this, of course, answered that second charge. Number 3, remember they said he had profaned the temple, and he tells them he didn't profane the temple. He said, in fact, I came to Jerusalem for the very purpose of honoring the Jewish people and their temple. I came and brought alms to my nation because I love this nation, basically, is what he told them. In other words, I brought money with me, and I distributed that among the Jews. Besides that, when they found me in the temple, I was purified. I wasn't polluting anything, and I never had any Gentiles with me. And then he tells them, and besides this, the Jews that have accused me of these things, the very men that have accused me ought to be here themselves, if they have any proof. And they ought to be offering that proof, but they weren't there. You see, that was his point. No one was there with any evidence whatsoever to accuse him of anything. And so Paul then refutes those charges rather handily. Felix, as he thought about the matter, decided to suspend judgment until he could talk to Lysias. Remember, Tertullus had told him that Lysias would confirm all these things. Lysias was the Roman soldier, remember, back at Jerusalem, that had delivered Paul from the Jewish mob and had sent him by night down to Caesarea. And so he decides that, I'm going to wait and I'll talk to Lysias about the matter. So he kept Paul bound there, and a few days later, Felix and his wife Drusilla brought Paul in to hear about the Christian faith. They wanted to hear more about that. Really, Felix had an ulterior motive. He was looking for a bribe. He wanted Paul to pay money to release him. And the fact that Paul had brought up, remember, that he'd brought alms to his nation, that just caused Felix to see dollar signs, as we would say today. He just saw an opportunity to make money. That if Paul could raise money for his nation, then he might be able to raise a pretty good sum of money to buy his freedom. And Felix would just take advantage of this and extort Paul if he could. Of course, Paul was not going to pay Felix money to be released. Felix didn't know Paul very well. Nonetheless, he and his wife Drusilla arranged to give Paul a hearing concerning the Christian faith. Now, Drusilla was the sister of Herod, and she had been married to another king, and this man was the king of Azizus, his name was Azizus. He was the king of Emesa. And when Felix had come into Caesarea to take the governorship, he had seen Drusilla. And evidently she was an extremely beautiful woman. He desired her very much. And so he sent one of his friends to talk to Drusilla, to tell her that Felix had a great interest in her, that if she would leave her husband and marry Felix, he would make her a happy woman, which she did. And she left this king that she was married to, and she married Felix. So Paul took this opportunity then to tell them of the Christian faith, but the Bible says that he reasoned unto them of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come. He gave Felix and Drusilla just what they needed to hear. And the Bible says that when he had finished, Felix trembled. He answered Paul, "Go thy way. When I have a convenient season, I'll call for you." But of course, during the 2 years that he held Paul still in bonds, he sent for Paul quite often to hear him, not because he had an interest in obeying the gospel and becoming a Christian, but simply for the purpose of perhaps getting a bribe if Felix would release him. And of course, he never did get that bribe from Paul because Paul was not going to pay it. Now, after 2 years, after Paul was there 2 years imprisoned, a fellow named Festus, Porcius Festus, came in to take the governorship from Felix. Now, here's how we know the accuracy of our dates. You can read about it in history that Festus took Felix's place in 60 AD. And if Paul's already been bound for 2 years, that means he started his prison sentence in 58. So 58, 59, and parts of 60, 2 years, Paul was kept there as a prisoner in Caesarea. And there's where we get the accuracy of our dates, the appointment of Festus to take Felix's place as governor. You see, Claudius Caesar, who was the emperor of Rome from 41 to 54, he had given Felix his governorship. And although Felix had done some good things, he had cleared the province there of robbers. Felix had done several favors for the Jews. You know, Paul reminded him of that, and so did Tertullus. They acknowledged the fact that he'd been good to the Jewish people in many ways, but he had also been horrible to them. You see, down in Caesarea, there was a feud, a standing feud between the Syrians and the Jews over the city of Caesarea, whether it ought to be Jewish or Romans. And they never did get that settled. And there was a riot that had recently occurred down there in Caesarea between Jews and Romans, and Felix and his soldiers had sided with the Syrians. Not only sided with them, Josephus says they killed 20,000 Jews down there in Caesarea. And according to Josephus, they plundered and ransacked their houses. And of course, this caused great problems to the Jews, so much so that they sent word to the emperor about this matter. They accused Felix of very serious crimes. And Felix was brought by Nero, who was then the emperor, because Nero ruled from 54 to 68, and the year now is 60 AD. Nero called Felix to Rome to question him about this matter, and the Jews went to accuse him of these crimes before Nero. So this was what was taking place. Well, that left a vacancy in the governorship, and that's when Porcius Festus came in 60 AD and took Felix's place there as governor. Now, as for Festus, he was completely unfamiliar with the Jewish customs. Felix wasn't. But Festus didn't know very much about Jewish law and Jewish customs. After he arrived in Caesarea, 3 days later, he decided he'd go up to Jerusalem. He would meet the high priest and get acquainted with them, since he was ruling over Jews as part of the people that he would rule. Of course, he wanted to make their acquaintance and announce his governorship and such things as this. And he was politicking too, of course. And when he went up, of course, the high priest, he sees now a new person in the office of governor. He sees an opportunity perhaps to get some cooperation regarding Paul. For 2 years, they've never forgotten Paul. They can't get him off their mind. They still hate him. They still want him dead. And so they try to trick Festus, because they know he doesn't know the customs or the law. And they request that Paul be brought up to Jerusalem to be tried. And Festus tells them, no, he's down at Caesarea, and if you want to accuse him of different things, you come down there and we'll have his trial at Caesarea. For whatever reason, that's the route that he chose to take with them. And of course, that served Paul quite well for him to be kept at Caesarea. They would have killed him had he gone back up to Jerusalem. They would have laid wait on the way and butchered him on the way to Jerusalem. He would have never made it, and he knew that. Nonetheless, 10 days later, they all came down to Caesarea, and they had a trial there. And these Jews, of course, brought their charges, and Paul, of course, made his defense. When the situation ended, Festus saw that there really wasn't any accurate charge against Paul. There was nothing there charged against him that was worthy of death or even bonds. I mean, he should have been set at liberty. But you know, Festus is new at the governorship, and he's a politician, and he decided to see if Paul would go up to Jerusalem to be tried up there, because the Jews had made that request, and the trial had produced nothing down here at Caesarea. And so he asked Paul, would you be willing to go up to Jerusalem? Paul knew he'd never make it to Jerusalem. They'd kill him on the way. And he said, no, I won't go. I appeal to Caesar. I'm a citizen, and I'm going to make an appeal to Caesar. Now, he had the right to do that as a Roman citizen. And that meant that they had to take him to Rome to stand trial before Nero himself. But you see, Paul didn't really want to do that. It was just the only way that he could save his life. And so he made an appeal there to Caesar. And when a Roman citizen made an appeal like that, it had to be granted. So Festus didn't really have any choice. Just a few days later, I'm sure Festus was contemplating when he might get Paul to Rome and when would be a convenient time. It so happens that King Agrippa and his sister Bernice came down, and they came to congratulate Festus on his appointment to the governorship. And of course, they came with great pomp and ceremony and such things. And as they were visiting, Festus told Agrippa, he said, I've got a fellow, a prisoner here named Paul. He's a Jew. And the Jews are accusing him of various things, and there's been no evidence provided, and they're clamoring for his death. And he's had to make an appeal to Caesar, and I'm going to have to send him to Caesar. But he said, he tells Agrippa, the problem is I don't have anything to charge him with. I don't know what to say. And I hate to send a man to the emperor and not state the charges against him. Well, Agrippa says, you know, I've heard about this fellow. I've heard about this faith. I'd like to hear this man. And Festus says, well, tomorrow you will. So they appoint a time, and here comes Agrippa and his sister Bernice, and they come in all their pomp and royalty and everything and take their seats, and Festus is there, and so Paul is given an opportunity to speak for himself, because after all, Agrippa wants to hear what he's got to say. And he tells the story of his conversion. Again, that's found 3 times in Acts 9, Acts 22, and now in Acts 26, when he is before Agrippa. If you'll put all 3 of those records together, you'll get the complete picture and story of Paul's conversion. Nonetheless, Paul defends himself, and you know, Festus interrupts him on one occasion. He says, Paul, you're mad. It's obvious Paul is a very well-educated man. And he said, much learning's made you mad. Paul, you're crazy. You're out of your mind. Paul said, I'm not out of my mind, Festus. But I'm speaking soberness here. I'm speaking truth. And he said, Agrippa knows these things. He knows the law. And so Paul turned to Agrippa and he said, King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? I know thou believest. And then that's when Agrippa told Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. Almost. But he wasn't persuaded, and that broke the meeting up, and they dismissed and everything. And then right after that, of course, Agrippa and Festus were discussing the matter of Paul, and Agrippa said, this man really ought to be set at liberty. He's done nothing worthy of death, and he's done nothing really worthy of bonds. And he said he might have been set free had he not appealed to Caesar. But you see, they were trying to force Paul to go up to Jerusalem again, and he would not do it. He kept that appeal to Caesar. And so nonetheless, Agrippa tells Festus, you don't have any choice. The man has appealed to Caesar let him go. And that seemed to be the ultimate conclusion. Now the year is 60 AD, friends. So over the 2 years that we've talked about that Paul was in prison there at Caesarea, the events that we've just talked about have transpired, and now it's around the fall of 60 AD. Actually, they get a little bit too late a start on the voyage to Rome, but Paul is brought now to Nero, and of course he's sent by ship instead of overland. And the time period now on Paul's voyage to Rome will cover a period from the fall of 60 AD till the spring of 61 AD. We know that because of Festus's appointment as governor. Paul is taken then to a ship. He is turned over to Julius, who is a centurion. Now remember, a centurion has 1,000 soldiers underneath him. And so he's given to this, he has 100 soldiers underneath him. And Julius, this centurion, takes Paul as well as other prisoners and boards the ship there in Caesarea. Luke accompanies Paul on this voyage to Rome, and so does another brother in the church. His name is Aristarchus. And Aristarchus was from Thessalonica up in Macedonia. So you've got Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus are the Christians that are on this ship. And there are other prisoners, and of course there's sailors. They departed on a ship that's from Adramyttium. Adramyttium, incidentally, was on the coast of Mysia. If I could find, I don't think Mysia's name specifically, but right along in here on the map is a city called Troas. Remember, that's where Paul had a vision when a man from Macedonia said, come over into Macedonia and help us. Mysia was just north of there, up in this region right around here. And that's where this ship was that they caught down here at Caesarea. Now, this is a map, supposedly of Paul's voyage to Rome and such things. We'll be using it off and on here for just a little while in our summary. Nonetheless, the ship is from this region. It's a coastal vessel. What do we mean by coastal vessel? Well, it's going to make stops along the seacoast of not only Palestine, but also what was called then Asia or Asia Minor to us. And so it was going to make stops periodically along at different ports, either taking on cargo or delivering cargo that it had. And so it set sail there from Caesarea in the fall of 60 AD. Paul on the way to Rome now to face Nero, the emperor. It first stopped at a place called Sidon, here on the coast of Syria, Palestine. Right here is Sidon. Here's Caesarea, and just north of it up the coast, just a little ways, is Sidon. There were brethren there, and that gave Paul an opportunity to see those brethren. He found great favor, incidentally, with the centurion Julius, who gave him this liberty. And then, of course, making that short visit, he boarded ship again. And he would never been without a soldier. Don't Don't misunderstand that. He would have been kept in chains and different things. He would have probably been chained to a soldier at all times. They're not going to just let him roam a town somewhere, free, because they would never grant a liberty like that. Julius would be under penalty of death if he escaped. But nonetheless, making that visit there at Sidon, they board ship again, and they sailed on up. Now, normally a ship that would be going along the coast of Asia Minor would come underneath Cyprus to the south. Remember, Cyprus is this island out here in the Mediterranean. This is where Barnabas was born and raised. He was a native of Cyprus. They would normally sail underneath it and come along the coast here of Asia Minor, but the winds were contrary. And evidently, they were very strong westerly winds at this time. And that kept them from coming underneath the island. So in order to catch a windbreak, Luke tells us they went around this east side of Cyprus and up around the northeast corner of it and made a trip this way. And there's a reason. That not only gave them a windbreak, but I think I showed you this when we did the study. There's a natural ocean current that runs from east to west right along this coast here. And I'm told the speed of it is some maybe 3 miles an hour. And it greatly aids and assists any ship that's sailing west, from east to west. So they could have gone up around this north part here of Cyprus and got in that current, you see. And that current ran all the way along this coastline. So that would have made sailing perhaps a little bit easier. They reached a place right here called Myra, M-Y-R-A, on the coast here of Cilicia. And there they changed ships. And they caught them a ship down here from Alexandria, down in Egypt. Now, there were a lot of ships that sailed out of Egypt, out of Alexandria area down here, to Rome, because they hauled grain. And the Romans bought a lot of grain out of Egypt. And this was a grain vessel. We know that because later they will have to throw the wheat they'll shovel the wheat out and throw it overboard just to lighten the ship. Nonetheless, they caught this grain ship of Alexandria that was headed to Rome, and so they get off the coastal vessel that they're now on because they're really not wanting to follow the coast any further. They need to get out on the open waters and start sailing toward Rome. So they changed the vessels here at Myra and got on this ship. Now, as they sailed on west, they were going to go to Sindus over here and then just come north of Crete, underneath Greece, Achaia over here where Corinth was. They would have sailed out through the open waters up here to Italy. But the winds were contrary. They barely reached Sindus. They sailed from Myra to Sindus on this grain vessel, and the winds were so difficult, it just took them days. So they wasted a lot of time just on a very short stretch. This ought to have been covered perhaps a day and a half at the most. And now they wind up spending several days and barely reach Sindus. And so they struck out from there, but the winds caught them again and kind of blew them back east and toward the south, and that forced them to run underneath the island of Crete. Now these winds evidently were really getting bad, and so they reached port here about halfway down the island of Crete. Remember, it was a place called Fair Havens. It had a harbor, but it wasn't a good harbor. It wasn't a good harbor to winter in because the way the harbor faced, the weather came right in on you, and it just was not conducive to winter there. And Paul advised them when they got here. He said, listen, you need to quit sailing right now. Don't go any further because it's going to cause loss of life or great damage to the ship and your cargo. And so I'm advising you don't go on. Well, the shipmaster and the owner of the ship, they wanted to keep going. This was not a good harbor. There was a place over here on the western side of the island, on the south of it, and the west side, called Phoenix. It had a terrific harbor for winter. And so their plan was, if we can catch just the right wind, then we're going to leave Fair Havens and we're going to sail underneath Crete and see if we can reach Phoenix, and we will winter there. But we don't want to winter here at Fair Havens. Not a good island, or not a good seaport for this. They finally caught a south wind, and when a soft breeze blew from the south, they thought, well, we've got the wind we need now. That should give us time to get from Fair Havens over here to Phoenix, and so they set sail. But as soon as they rounded a cape there and got out, even though they were still close to land, they got hit by a strong wind, and Luke calls it Euroclydon. Euroclydon. And what it means is a wave-stirring easter. It was a horrible wind, a horrible storm that came up here out of the northeast, and eventually it usually shifted east. And it just made sailing just nearly impossible, and no doubt it caused a lot of loss of life and cargo and ships through the years to run into these winds, and they were prevalent there in the fall of the year. That's one reason Paul advised them not to sail. You know, Paul had been on the ocean a lot. I know these sailors had, but Paul had. He'd traveled by ship all around the Mediterranean world, remember, on several of his missionary journeys. He was shipwrecked 3 different times, remember, and he tells us in 2 Corinthians 11 that on one occasion he spent a night and a day in the deep, and so stranded there in the waters a day and a half. And nonetheless, they strike out and they get caught now in this Euroclydon, in this very strong wind. And they've really got a problem on their hands. They could not take the route they wanted. In fact, that wind carried them down under another island down here south of Phoenix called Clauda. Clauda, it's just a small island here. And they sailed underneath it. You see, this is a northeast wind, and so they sailed underneath it to the south, and they got just a little bit of break from that north wind, that northeast wind. And while they had that little calm there, and they didn't have a calm for very few miles, maybe it's estimated 12 to 14 miles of little calmer water, it was still not calm, but calm enough to do some things. So they decided, we'll make some preparation underneath this island while we can. We can't stay here. There's no place to harbor here. So they did what was called then undergirding the ships, and that was a process, remember, where they passed ropes or cables underneath the hull. And they fastened those ropes or cables to the deck because the ships then were made out of planks. And the effort was being made in doing this to keep the planks from separating where the ship would take on water. They wanted to keep the planks tightly bound together. And so these timbers, and so they passed those ropes or cables around the hull to strengthen that hull of the ship to where they could get out on the waters, and perhaps the ship would hold up without taking on water and leaking and sinking. And they did some other things too. They took down the mast, the main mast, and they took down the main sails and the other sails, and they laid them on the deck. Because the last thing you need in a strong wind like this are sails. And Luke tells us also that they turned that vessel to broadside to the wind. Now picture the wind coming in this way. So they just turned the ship broadways, and they were going to just take the sails down and just let the wind push it along, see, at any rate that it might take it. But they could not afford to have sails up. It would have torn the sails up anyway, but it would have caused the vessel, of course, to move faster than what they desired. But more than that, down here along the coast of North Africa, here's Egypt on the northern part of Africa, but as you come on down along the south end of the Mediterranean, along the North African shore here, between or west of Cyrene here and on toward Tripoli, there is a a very dangerous part of the water there. It's called a Syrtis, Syrtis. There's a minor Syrtis and a major Syrtis, and what this was a huge sandbank that extended for miles out in the Mediterranean. What they were afraid of was this wind would catch them, this northeast wind, and it would push them toward these sandbanks. Many ships got pushed into these banks, and the bow and the ship would stick in that sand, couldn't move, it was immovable, and then the winds and the waves would just beat the vessel apart, destroy the ship and destroy the crew and their lives and all the cargo. And this is what they feared, were certain nearly that it was going to happen. So that's why they did the undergirding, and they took the mast down and the main sails. They also lightened the ship as much as they could at this time, and they threw all of the tackling that they could overboard, anything they could find on that vessel and on the decks that they didn't need that would make the ship lighter. You see, they're worried about it sticking in that sandbar, so if they can lighten the ship and raise the hull up a little bit higher in the water, then of course they could navigate through a little bit more shallow water. And this is what they hope to do. They'd been at this 14 days, just carried by this wind. They'd just given up all hope of being saved. They had to labor day and night just to fight the winds and keep the vessel. And after about 14 days of this, Paul, of course, talked to the men. And but before that, they had actually heard of what they thought might be land nearby on the 14th day. And the reason is they could hear breakers, probably rocks, where waves were hitting rocks near the shoreline of some island or some land area. And they were just pretty certain that they were getting close to a piece of land. Now, here's the danger of that. Most of these islands and land masses had huge rocks. And if they just sailed blindly at night into that, they would have likely just hit rocks. It would have broken up the vessel, and being at night like that, every one of them would have perished. And so they decided, we better stop right here if we can. And they took 4 anchors and they threw them out the stern, the rear end of the ship. Normally you wouldn't take that many anchors, but they put 4 out of the rear end of that. And fortunately, in that particular area where they were, although they had no way of knowing this, the bottom of the ocean there was very conducive to holding anchors. Once an anchor hit that bottom, unless the cables that held it snapped, it was going to hold the ship in place. So they put the 4 anchors out, and the Bible says they just wished for day. They just needed daylight, because at daylight they decided that they would try to find an area conducive to landing and see if they could get the vessel close to shore, maybe even land it safely. So they put the anchors out then and wished for day. Paul told them, he said, look, you've been fasting now for 14 days. You've been working hard, and there's still things to do, and you're going to need energy. And so I'm suggesting that you take food that we all need to eat. And Paul took bread and he blessed it, and he and the others ate. All of them took nourishment. There were still things yet to do. And so this was a very fortunate thing that they had Paul. Paul tells them also about a vision that he's had. He said, an angel stood by me this night and told me that we're going to lose this vessel. And we're going to lose the cargo. But there won't be one life lost. Not one. We're going to be cast, he tells them, upon a certain island. And then he tells them, I believe God, that it will be even as he had told me. And that's Acts 27, verse 25. He tells them about that visit from an angel of the Lord. At midnight on that 14th night, the men thought they were close to land, and they, as I said, probably heard these rocks, and they sounded. And they took the depth of the ocean there. They found out that The depth was 20 fathoms. Now, friends, a fathom is 6 feet. If it's 20 fathoms, it's 120 feet deep. And then they went on just a little bit further and they decided we better check again and see if we're gradually getting into shallow water. They sounded again. This time the depth was 15 fathoms. It was 90 feet now. And now they say we better do something. And of course that's when they stopped the ship and cast the anchors out the stern and wished for day. But during that process, there was a lifeboat on board. They had taken up that boat underneath the island of Clauda there when they stopped. They'd gotten that vessel on board. You see, a lot of these ships pulled a boat behind them, a lifeboat, a fairly large little boat. And it was a lot of work to get it up on deck. But that's what they had done back there on Clauda. And so now these soldiers were letting that boat off the deck and letting it overboard. What they were pretending was, not the soldiers, I'm sorry, the sailors. The sailors on the vessel were going to put the boat back down in the water under the guise that they were going to put more anchors out there on the front part, see. But what they were really planning on doing was escaping in that boat and leaving everybody else on that ship. And Paul caught on to what they were doing. He saw what they were up to. But they were trying to escape from that ship. And Paul knew if they got away with that, they were doomed. Because you see, the next morning, friends, somebody's got to steer that vessel. Somebody's got to try to make a landing with it. And these sailors are the only ones with experience. So Paul told the centurion and the soldiers, he said, except these sailors here abide in the ship, you cannot be saved. Now God had guaranteed their lives. He said there won't be a loss of any life. You'll be cast on a certain island. But that did not keep Paul and others from their responsibility to preserve their own lives and to work to bring about God's foreknowledge there, to bring it to pass. If those sailors had actually got in that boat, there would have been anybody the next morning to steer the vessel, and likely everybody on that ship would have perished. So the soldiers then saw that the sailors were trying to escape, and they cut the ropes and let that lifeboat, that small boat, sail free. And that forced the sailors then to stay on board with them. And everything was better. At daybreak, after they'd spent a very sleepless night, because they'd worked all night, we might say that when they ate, they threw all the wheat overboard. Remember, this was a grain vessel. They threw all that overboard. They lightened the ship, because the next day they're going to need it riding high in the water, getting over as many rocks as they can, and trying to avoid a catastrophe that way. So they lightened it all they could. And come daybreak, they noticed a creek where it looked sandy. There looked like a little bit of a sandy beach there. And so they cut the anchors free. They didn't even try to raise them up. They just cut them loose. They hoisted the mast and they hoisted the main sail. Got that all set up because they needed wind. They needed to be able to try to guide that ship on the end of this sandy beach that they had discovered. And so they did. They struck the bottom of the ocean in there before they got to this island. And of course, it was a place where Luke says that two seas came together. I suppose what he means is two different currents. That is, currents from different directions. And when that ship stuck then in the sand and the bow stuck, the waves just beat the back end of the ship apart, just tore it up. Paul and the others that were with him, everyone on board, in fact, grabbed boards and planks and whatever they could find, and they made it all safely to shore. There were 276 of them, 276 on board that vessel. Paul had been shipwrecked 3 times. This is now the 4th time. And so they're safely on the island. They discovered that this is the island that they call Melita. We call it Malta, M-A-L-T-A today. And they were on this island about 3 months. On that island, you remember Paul did all kinds of miracles. Remember, as they were gathering wood for a fire, the people that were on the island had befriended them and helped them. They were building a fire, and Paul was carrying firewood, and when he reached to get the wood, a poisonous viper bit him. In fact, it just latched onto his hand, we're told. And nobody survived this particular viper. So these people there on the island, they expected Paul to swell up before much longer and eventually to die. He didn't even swell. He shook that snake off in the fire there and suffered no harm from the bite. And then that's when they've got to believing that he was God and such things. Paul wound up healing the father of the leader of the folks on that island. The guy's name was Publius. And his father had a dysentery. The Bible calls it a bloody flux and fever. And Paul healed him of this severe dysentery that he had. And then we're told that he healed many of the other people on that island. Everyone brought the sick then to Paul, and he healed them. Well, this caused Paul and all of his company to have great favor with those people on the island. They had really built great influence and respect and love there. And so when they got ready to leave the island in the spring, of course, the people on the island loaded them down with all kinds of provisions that they needed to get on to Rome. And this island, by the way, of Malta is not very far south of Sicily. And if you'll remember, Sicily is right at the toe of the boot that Italy forms there. It's just an island out here that there's a very narrow passageway through. And so that's the island they've wintered on. They actually caught another ship, we're told, of Adramyttium. Not Adramyttium, Alexandria. And it's another wheat vessel, another grain vessel. And it had wintered there on that island of Malta. And so they were able to catch that ship and sail then on to Rome. And Luke gives the account now of the voyage on up to Rome. The ship's name, incidentally, for what it's worth, if you want to remember it, is Castor and Pollux. These were the sons of Jupiter, the god Jupiter. These were his sons. And so they landed at Syracuse, which was on the island of Sicily. And, of course, they stayed there 3 days. Luke tells us they sailed from there to Rhegium, and then from Rhegium, they landed at a place called Puteoli. Puteoli was really the harbor that served the grain ships that served Rome. You had to stop at Puteoli. There wasn't a good harbor on up closer to Rome. So you stopped there and unloaded your cargo, and then that had to be transported by land up to Rome. And so they stopped there at Puteoli. They tarried there with brethren at Puteoli for about 7 days. Now, these brethren at Puteoli probably would have sent runners up to Rome to tell them Paul was on the way. Because the church at Rome, although they had a letter from Paul back in 58 AD when he was at Corinth, they had still never met Paul, and they were very anxious to meet this great apostle. And they had only read his letter and heard things about him. And now here he is on the way to their city to face Nero, Caesar. So the church at Rome sent 2 different groups of people. Some came down to a place that Luke says was called Appii Forum, and another place was called the 3 Taverns. And so they wanted to meet Paul on his way up to Rome and encourage him. And the Bible says that when Paul saw the brethren, he thanked God and took courage. It was a great boost to Paul, and just gave him much courage to see these brethren and know that they would travel on foot just to accompany him from where they located him and travel with him back up to Rome. Paul was brought to Rome, he and the other prisoners. The other prisoners were delivered to the captain of the guard there at Rome, and Paul was allowed to rent his own house and have his own hired house, and he had that for 2 years. Now, he still was chained to a soldier. He never did get out of his chains. unless it would be a temporary reprieve for something. But there was a soldier with him generally at all times, and of course they were changed out at different intervals, always awake, always fresh and alert. And so even though he had his own house, he was in chains still. But yet he had a lot of freedom. He had hoped, remember, when he wrote the Roman letter, Romans 1, verse 9 and 10, he said he hoped by the will of God to have a prosperous journey when he came to them. Well, I don't know how prosperous a shipwreck and a winter on the island of Malta was, but it was prosperous in the sense that Paul traveled to Rome and Caesar paid for the bill. So I guess you could say in that sense it was a prosperous journey. He made it to Rome, and Rome paid the expenses. So now he's at Rome, and he'll stay there for 2 years. It's the spring of 61. How do we know? Because Festus took over the governorship in 60. Paul left out roughly in the fall of 60 when he traveled to Rome, and he's shipwrecked all winter, and now it's the spring of 61. And he's going to stay a captive in Rome here now for 2 years. When he first got to Rome, he called the chief of the Jews together. He wanted to explain to them why he was here. He wanted them to know, I don't have anything I've come here to accuse my people of. I'm not accusing our nation of anything. The Jews have accused me. They've charged me with things I didn't do. And he tells them in order to save my life, I had to appeal to Caesar. And he wants them to know exactly why he's there and that he's not there to cause problems. He took the opportunity to set up and arrange a time with these Jews to preach to them. And he invited many of them into his lodging. And he spent about all day from morning till evening testifying to them from the law and the prophets about Christ and about the kingdom and such things and why Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God. And yet he failed to convert them. He might have made some progress with just a few, but he really failed to have much impact upon those Jews there at Rome. And so he finally gave them the warning from Isaiah the prophet that, that this people's heart is waxed gross and their ears are dull of hearing and their eyes they've closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, should be converted, and I should heal them. And he tells them, I will go to the Gentiles. You have judged yourselves unworthy here of everlasting life. And he had to do that on many occasions. So now no success much among the Jewish people there in Rome. During the time that Paul was here for 2 years, I took you through this. He wrote 4 letters, remember? Now let's go back over his epistles that he wrote right quickly. The first letters he wrote was 1 Thessalonians. He wrote it in 52 AD, and he wrote it from Corinth. In 53 AD, he wrote 2 Thessalonians. Those are the first 2 that he wrote. Later, he would write 1 Corinthians on his second journey from Ephesus in 57. He wrote 2 Corinthians shortly thereafter from Macedonia in 57. Then when he left Macedonia, went to Corinth. He wrote to the churches of Galatia in 57 AD from Corinth, and then wrote another letter to the Romans in 58 AD from Corinth. So now that's 1 and 2 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, and Romans are the first 6 letters that he wrote. Now when he gets to Rome here for this 2 years, he wrote 4 more letters. They are, first of all, the letter of Philemon, which he wrote in 61, 62 AD. Philemon lived at Colossae. He had a runaway slave named Onesimus, and he had come to Rome and sought Paul out, and Paul had converted him. And he sent him back to his master with the letter to Philemon, which is a little 1-chapter letter that we have over next to the book of Hebrews in our New Testament. Onesimus, that slave, would have carried that letter back to his master, Philemon, who was one of the brethren at Colossae. He wrote the Colossian letter from 61 or 62 AD, There was an evangelist named Epaphras that had come to Rome and told Paul of some doctrinal errors that Colossae had, and so Paul addressed those errors in the letter of Colossae, and he sent a man named Tychicus back to Colossae with that letter. Then Paul wrote in 61 or 62 also, besides Philemon, besides Colossians. He wrote the epistle we call Ephesians, and I mentioned so-called Ephesians. He wrote this around 61 to 62, and Tychicus also carried that letter. Onesimus carried the letter to Philemon. Tychicus carried this letter to Colossians, and the letter that we also call Ephesians. Now, there's much doubt that the letter we call Ephesians was actually written to the church in Ephesus, because the word Ephesus is mentioned here in chapter 1 of Ephesians, but in the older manuscripts it's not there. And many people believe this is what's called the lost letter to the Laodiceans. If you'll read Colossians 4:16, Paul mentions a letter he wrote to Laodicea. He wanted the Colossians to read the letter from Laodicea, and he wanted the Laodiceans to have the letter he had written to Colossians. He wanted them to swap those letters. And so we don't have an epistle in our New Testament called Laodiceans. We have Ephesians. And many people believe Ephesians is that letter, since Ephesus doesn't occur in the first chapter in the older manuscripts. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. I don't know exactly what's accurate here, but I wanted you to know that possibility, that Ephesians could well be this so-called lost letter to the Laodiceans and not to the Ephesians at all. In fact, Laodicea, when you look on a map, Laodicea is closer to Colossae than Ephesus is by far. And they're almost neighboring cities. And so this makes a whole lot of sense that it may well be that Laodicean letter. Nonetheless, you can think on that and have your own conclusions about it. There's no evidence one way or another. Then Paul wrote the fourth letter there while he was a prisoner at Rome, and that's Philippians. He's written Philemon, Colossae, what we call Ephesians, and now Philippians. Wrote this in 63 A.D. Philippi had supported Paul greatly at various times. When he left Macedonia, actually when he left Philippi and went over toward Thessalonica, 100 miles west, and then down to Berea, which was another 60 miles southwest of Thessalonica, the Philippians had sent money to him when he left there. And they had sent money to him when he was at Corinth. Time and again they had sent to his necessity. And now here at Rome, it's been quite a while since he's heard from Philippi, since they've sent anything, but Epaphroditus, one of the disciples there at Philippi, brings money from the church there at Philippi, and Paul writes back thanking them and addressing certain things in regard to that congregation as well. They were very closely connected. Remember, Philippi is where Lydia and her household were converted. It's where the Philippian jailer was converted. And so there had been a congregation there for a long time. That was the first church that Paul had established on the continent of Europe. Paul was released. He expected to be released from prison here this first time. He made an answer to Nero, and evidently Nero let him go. Nothing to charge him with. He's a Roman citizen. And so he's freed, and so he's able to travel from 63 up to through 67, perhaps, part of 67. He freely traveled between churches. Now, we have somewhat of his activities during that time, and here's how we have them. We have them from the epistles that he'd written, like Philemon and Colossians and Ephesians and also Philippians, also a little bit out of the book of Romans. We have Paul's intentions of traveling certain places, and he expected to be released. And in fact, there's great evidence that he was released from prison. If you'll read Philippians 1:26, don't have time to go through these again. Philippians 1:26, Philippians 2:24, Philemon, verse 22, all talk about the possibility of his release. Paul even tells him, prepare me a lodging. He tells Philemon and the Colossians there, prepare me a lodging, because I expect to come to you rather soon. There are some conjectural travels. By conjectural, between these two captivities, we mean that we don't really have proof that Paul went to these places, just statements of his intentions to do so. Those cities are Philippi, Colossae, Spain, and Clement, by the way, that's mentioned by Paul in Philippians 4:3, says that Paul did go to Spain, and many of the early church historians believe that he actually went as far as Spain, in between these two captivities when he's released, in between the two imprisonments there at Rome. Then we have some of his what's called authentic travels. Now catch this. You've got conjectural travels, travels we can't prove, places that Paul intended to go. And then you have what's called authentic travels, that is, places we know he went. And how do we know he went? Because we read 1 Timothy and Titus and 2 Timothy, and we know he'd been to many places. Therefore, we know he was released. That's part of the evidence that he was released from his first imprisonment before he was arrested again and did some traveling. So when you study 1 Timothy and Titus and 2 Timothy, and they're so valuable, then you're going to learn that Paul actually visited Ephesus, Crete, Miletus, Troas, Corinth, Nicopolis. All of these are mentioned in those letters of Titus and 1 and 2 Timothy. And so they're called authentic travels. He actually went to those places. I could quote to them, I'll just pick one of them out. We know he was at Crete. 1 Timothy tells us he was in chapter 1, verse 5. He tells Titus, for this cause left I thee in Crete, that thou shouldest set in order the things that are wanting and ordain elders in every city as I'd appointed thee. So Paul said, I left you in Crete, that implying that he's been on that island with Titus working. So we know he's been to Crete, see, an island out in the Mediterranean off the coast of Asia Minor. And so this is the evidence that we have. That's the value of these epistles. When Paul is brought to Rome and he talks to the Jews there, as we noticed a moment ago, we lose Luke's record after this. He shuts down Acts. And you know, when you lose Luke, you lose your great historian. He's the one that gives us such great detail about Paul's life, and we wouldn't know anything about Paul after this 2 years at Rome if it weren't for the fact that we've got 1 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Timothy. And so, incidentally, we might talk about these three epistles. He wrote these during this period between the two captivities, that is, at least two of them, and one of them after he was captured the second time. He wrote 1 Timothy approximately 66 or 67 AD from Macedonia. And there seems to be great evidence of that from 1 Timothy 1 verse 3 and 1 Timothy 3, 14, 15. So anyway, he writes in 66, 67. That's 1 Timothy. Let's remember now, he's written 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Romans. Then he's written Philemon, Colossians, he's written Ephesians, and he's written Philippians. And now, having been released from his first imprisonment, he writes 1 Timothy in 66, 67 AD. That's about if I'm counting right, about the 11th epistle that he wrote. The 12th epistle, of course, is Titus. He wrote that in 67 AD, possibly from Ephesus, although we don't know. So now that's his 12th letter that he's written, the book of Titus, 67 AD. In between the two imprisonments, 1 Timothy and Titus, in between. Then he gets arrested again in 67 and finally executed in 68. And the authority for this, of course, is 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy is very valuable to us. It was written around 68 AD. After Paul's first answer before Nero, he talks about having given an answer before Nero that he said, no one was with me at my first reply, my first answer. That's in 2 Timothy 4:16. When you read 2 Timothy, of course, he's writing this to Timothy. He longed to see Timothy again. That's his own son in the gospel. We don't know if Timothy ever made it to Rome and that Paul got to see him again before he died. We can only hope he did. And there's some evidence that he did. But he wants Timothy to come, to be there shortly, to come shortly, he says, and then he tells him to come before winter. And he says, bring Mark with you. This is the John Mark now that abandoned Paul and Barnabas on that first journey. And he's the one that wrote the Gospel of Mark. And Paul's got great confidence in him now. All of their trouble's been put behind them. And now he tells Timothy, please bring Mark with you. He's profitable to me for the ministry. He really trusted Mark. So Mark had proved himself, you see. All of his old friends now basically are gone. He's alone there at Rome. He's got company around him, but they're not the old friends. He said, only Luke is with me. That's what he told Timothy. That beloved physician that he loved so much, that made the voyage with him from Caesarea all the way to Rome, has still stayed with him there in Rome. And he said, only Luke's with me. And he did love Luke. He writes Timothy and he says, the cloak that I left at Troas with Miletus, or with Trophimus rather, bring me that cloak. He would need that heavy garment here with a cold Rome winter coming on, and in a damp prison now, because he doesn't have his own hired house anymore. He said, bring my books, but especially the parchments. The parchments would have been the Old Testament scriptures. And what Paul wouldn't give to have those parchments with him. There in a lonely prison in Rome, the scriptures would be a great source of comfort to Paul, and he would read and read and read those scriptures. Even though he's inspired, you see, he studied as he commanded Timothy. He anticipates death. He tells Timothy in 2 Timothy 4, verses 6 to 8, that we often cite, I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. I've fought a good fight. I've finished my course. I've kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them also that love is appearing. Paul anticipated death with great joy. He had fought the good fight, and he had finished his course and kept the faith. Henceforth, he said, there's laid up for me a crown of righteousness. He looked forward to that day. We don't know, as I said, if Timothy arrived. We do learn from the book of Hebrews that Timothy was released from prison. If you'll read Hebrews 12, or 13 rather, Hebrews 13, verse 23, it states that Timothy had been released. So evidently, some think he came to Rome, was arrested with Paul there, and then, of course, subsequently released. And if that's the case, then Paul probably got to see Timothy. We can only hope he did this one last time. If the death of Paul, if tradition is correct, Paul would have been beheaded with the sword in 68 AD. Beheaded there just outside the city of Rome. I read to you a couple of accounts of that I think might be well as we close this whole series, to just read once again. One of them are a couple of great historians, two men called Conybeare and Howson. They had a book published, The Life and Epistles of St. Paul, which was published around 1854, if I remember correctly. And it is a wonderful book, over 800 pages. And it's just packed with information that's useful in the study of Paul. I added that book to my library many years ago. I've never regretted it. Out of that book, here's a quote from these two men. Now, what they're doing here now, this is sheer speculation of what it might have been like when Paul was led through the city of Rome on the way to his execution. I want to quote now from these men, quote, "As the martyr and his executioners passed on, their way was crowded with a motley multitude of goers and comers between the metropolis and its harbor. Merchants hasting to superintend the unloading of their cargoes. Sailors eager to squander the profits of their last voyage in the dissipations of the capital. Officials of the government charged with administration of the provinces or the command of the legions on the Euphrates or on the Rhine. Chaldean astrologers, Phrygian eunuchs, dancing girls from Syria with their painted turbans, mendicant priests from Egypt howling for Osiris, Greek adventurers eager to coin their national cunning into Roman gold, representatives of the avarice and ambition, the fraud and lust, the superstition and intelligence of the imperial world. Through the dust and tumult of that busy throng, the small group of soldiers threaded their way silently under the bright sky of an Italian midsummer. They were marching, though they knew it not, in a procession more truly triumphal than any that had ever followed in the train of general or emperor along the sacred way. Their prisoner, now at last and forever delivered from his captivity, rejoiced to follow his Lord without the gate. The place of execution was not far distant, and there the sword of the headsman ended his long course of sufferings and released that heroic soul from that feeble body. Weeping friends took up his corpse and carried it for burial to those subterranean labyrinths where through many years or ages of oppression, the persecuted church found refuge for the living and sepulchres for the dead. Thus died the apostle, the prophet, and the martyr, bequeathing to the church in her government and her discipline the legacy of his apostolic labors, leaving his prophetic words to be her living oracles, pouring forth his blood to be the seed of 1,000 martyrdoms. Thenceforth among the glorious company of the apostles, among the goodly fellowship of the prophets, among the noble army of martyrs, his name has stood preeminent. And wheresoever the Holy Church throughout all the world doth acknowledge God, there Paul of Tarsus is revered as the great teacher of a universal redemption, the herald of glad tidings to all mankind." Unquote. Quite a document, quite a statement by these two gentlemen. I leave you with one other. A fellow by the name of Monod wrote this about Paul, quote, "Go and inquire at Ephesus who it was that gave them a Christian church. Ephesus will answer with one voice, the Apostle Paul. Tarsus, the Apostle Paul. Thessalonica, the Apostle Paul. Athens, the Apostle Paul. Corinth, the Apostle Paul. Are you wearied by this enumeration? Let us cut it short. Salamis, Paphos, Antioch in Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, Perga, Troas, Philippi, Berea, Caesarea, Galatia, Phrygia, Mysia, Pamphylia, Cilicia, and how many others? The Apostle Paul. We are astonished at the amount accomplished by a man, a single man," unquote. That's from Monod now. And so these are just interesting writings by men, not inspired, but of course they're writings about the final end of Paul and his legacy. And this concludes the series on Paul, now some 30 to 31 studies that we've done. It's been a lengthy one again tonight, as so many of these have been, and you've been wonderful to be with us. And so on behalf of Mark and Ben, I want to thank you for joining us in this final study. And the three of us together want to wish you a very wonderful week ahead and a very wonderful evening. We hope it's a very pleasant good evening. Not sure of the topic that we will deal with next, but we'll be messaging and we'll be putting up something. Ben or Miguel or one of us will put it up on the website, and you'll know soon the direction that we're going and what topic we've chosen to study with you in the future. We may do a topical study or two before we pick up another series, and quite possibly the book of Daniel. So if you will bear with us, we'll make that decision as we think about it and pray about it, and we'll be getting word to you. Until we join you, Lord willing, next week, may the Lord richly bless and keep you.